Since announcing my departure from indie game dev in favor of writing novels, I got a lot of comments suggesting I try making visual novels instead. I figured I'd take this opportunity to talk about why I have no interest in that, and what exactly the difference is between writing for a game and writing for a book. It turns out it's a lot deeper than you might think. But before we get started, I want to let you know my first book got funded on Kickstarter in just 2 hours, and now we're working towards unlocking some awesome stretch goals. If you want to get back into reading with an exciting and short book, or you're already a reader and are looking for something new to read, with a story about getting a team together to kill a dragon but no one really trusts each other, you can pick up the limited edition hardcover signed by me and learn more by checking out the Kickstarter. First, let's start with the obvious. Books are linear, but games don't have to be. Stories in games can be experienced through a seemingly endless array of possible structures. The most basic example of a not strictly speaking linear structure are Telltale games, though players often find the consequences of branching decisions in those games unsatisfying and often illusory. With more complexity, we arrive at games like Fallout New Vegas or Disco Elysium, where things can go very differently depending on all sorts of choices you make throughout the game. But what's often ignored when comparing story structures in games versus books is what I'm going to broadly refer to as the narrative goal. To illustrate what this means, I'd like to present to you one of my favorite games you might not have heard of, Enderal: Forgotten Stories. Enderal is actually a Skyrim mod, though calling it that fails to do it justice. It really is a game in its own right with a unique world and rich lore, and when I finished my first playthrough, I was absolutely shaken. Enderal has some phenomenal storytelling in it, but there's one problem. Like most RPGs, Enderal allows for some degree of player choice, but it ultimately exists within certain limitations that restrict your agency. You only have so many dialogue options to choose from, so many voice lines you might hear, and specific categories of outcomes that might befall you. Increasing the complexity one step further brings us to another game that originated as a Skyrim mod. Increasing the narrative structure complexity one step further brings us to another game that originated as a Skyrim mod, The Forgotten City. In this game, you still have limited dialogue options, obviously, but the game incorporates a time loop, enabling you to acquire more and more knowledge to then alter outcomes as you go. And the more knowledge you have at the end of the game, the better outcomes you might be able to reach. The time loop concept is also beautifully used in the Outer Wilds, where although you don't really have branching quest choices and there is only one real end, except for some meme endings, the player is at liberty to go anywhere they want, driven only by their ability to observe something intriguing and a desire to learn more. In this sense, the story becomes not so much the one you discover as you play, but the series of real events that you, the player, not your character, but you, Greg, the player, experience. There are plenty of games that put you on rails and talk to your character and present an emotional story. Thinking back to games I used to play growing up, Halo and Black Ops come to mind. Enderal, I'd say, is another example, though a bit less linear. But games have the ability to do more than just orate a narrative at you. They can create a series of events unique to you that become part of your story, your life. But to do this, they can't just rely on text alone. In the Outer Wilds, the text you find reveals information about events that happened in the distant past. It will certainly make you think, there is an explicit story being told there, but the higher order implicit story is the story of you discovering those secrets. And for those secrets to be interesting, a great deal of care has to be put into the design of set pieces. Someone had to realize that every time you wake up, you should see the probe shoot off in a different direction. Someone had to realize that when you approach certain areas from certain angles, you can only see part of the picture. There are all sorts of subtle twists in the visuals. The worlds guide you in ways you don't even think about. And then on top of all that beautiful artistry, you have the core mechanics of your ship and flight and gravity and the behaviors of all the different planets. My point is, there's a lot more to a game's narrative than just the text that you write. But let's take this one step further. A game can convey meaning in numerous beautiful creative ways, but that meaning requires a huge amount of infrastructure just to begin to come to fruition. Let's take the example of visual novels. On a technical level, visual novels are pretty easy to make. You need a system to load images, a system to handle the dialogue, the basic saving and loading and menus that every game needs, and that's about it. But is that really trivial? In a sense, if you build one visual novel, you can reuse that code forever. But what absolutely tanks the budget of a game like that is the art. Art is not cheap, whether you make it yourself or hire an artist. Either it takes up a huge amount of your time or your money. People suggested that I look at Road Warden. Even that highly text-based game is extremely beautiful. The artwork is very carefully crafted. Let's take one step back and apply this to all games universally. Let's say you have a story you want to tell and you are convinced that a game is the best way to convey it. If the idea you have in mind is something like the Outer Wilds, obviously the fact that you're trying to create an open-ended experience means that a game probably is the way to go. But let's say you're trying to tell a more linear story like in Halo, and you're making primarily a first-person shooter. Like I alluded to, there's a lot of overhead to be done just to tell that story. You have a lot more work ahead of you than just creating a beautiful narrative. All the work that the dialogue will take, the music, the visuals, the color, the mood, the atmosphere, the music, all that is a whole set of of disciplines in of themselves, like making a movie, and it doesn't matter that your game isn't AAA. There are a lot of dimensions to building a narrative for a game. On top of all that, you have the whole additional equally important dimension of gameplay. Your weapons have to feel good. You have to find the right weapons and the levels at the right time, placed in the right locations. Enemies have to be precisely challenging enough. Animations need to be well timed. Not one single element of your game can be set aside. You can't be lazy with the gameplay if you want to tell a good story. Your gameplay has to be perfect and your story has to be perfect. It isn't going to be, but that should be the target. If you want to make a game, presumably you want to make a good game. A game that is art, a game that is beautiful, or even just a game that's fun. All of this takes an enormous amount of effort and precision. Personally, I'd rather really focus my attention on just getting good at storytelling without all that technical overhead. I would also like to be able to just begin to work and see the story come to fruition immediately. The truth about stories in games is that a game just isn't really the best medium to tell a story. Games fundamentally are experiences. Whether they are narrative or gameplay focused, multiplayer or single player, the real stories games create are the choices you make, the discoveries you find, and the unique series of events that you went through. I talked a lot about the freedom that designing narrative structures for games provide, so given all that potential, why write a book? Is it not better to create experiences than to just relay a linear series of events using words on a page? I would say no. Relaying a linear narrative using words on a page is a whole different kind of art, and one that has lasted throughout human history. I've recently been learning just how artful the use of words can be, how it's not just a matter of explicitly telling the reader what is happening, but by painting a picture with pure text. I also find myself less and less motivated to create the kinds of interactive experiences that I believe games are best suited for. I would much prefer to tell a linear story and have you engage with the text than to have to deal with all the game development related overhead required to tell that story. The point is, if you want to make a game and you want to tell a story, don't. Choose one. Make something that gives players a real meaningful experience so that in playing the game, that very activity becomes the story. Or if you do want to tell a story, just isolate the medium down to focus on creating the best story you can. Also, writing a book is a million times easier, despite still being pretty hard. It's also a much easier career, and in the next video I intend to talk about why that is, so stay tuned. If you enjoyed this video, please consider checking out the Kickstarter and help reach some stretch goals so that the book can be as good as it can possibly be. Thanks so much for watching, and God bless.